Calvin Reyes was 37 years old the night his wife told her friends, in a restaurant he had chosen and a meal he had paid for, that she had married beneath herself. And the only remarkable thing about the moment was how completely she believed it. To Vanessa, and to the circle of women she had assembled around the long table at Della's that Saturday in Nashville, Calvin was a reasonable enough man who had never quite reached the altitude she deserved. He wore plain clothes. He drove a Silverado with 90,000 miles on it. He worked, as far as she had ever cared to understand it, in construction. Something with buildings, something with numbers, something she described to her colleagues as project management. In a tone that made clear she considered the words interchangeable with limited ambitions. Her friends called him Steady Calvin. Not unkindly, exactly, not kindly either. He was sitting at the far end of the table when she said it. She had turned to her friend Pamela and said, with the practiced lightness of a woman accustomed to her own candor, "Honestly, I think I married down. I love him, but we both know it." She laughed the way people laugh when they want you to understand they are telling the truth. He heard every word. He set his napkin beside his plate, pushed back his chair, and left without speaking. No cine, no raised voice, no goodbye. What Vanessa did not know then, what none of those women knew, was that Calvin Rees had spent 8 years building a real estate development company with operating assets of $4.7 million, structured entirely outside anything she had ever thought to put her name on. 6 months later, she called his number 47 times in a single day. He did not answer once. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. There was a house in East Nashville that Calvin had been renovating on the weekends for the better part of a year, a 1940s craftsman on a corner lot, the kind of place that had been let go by a succession of landlords who had mistaken neglect for thrift. He had bought it at a tax auction for $60 million and spent his Saturdays stripping it back to its bones. New joists, repointed brick, a kitchen layout he had drawn himself on graph paper at the kitchen table in the house he shared with Vanessa while she was out at events he was never invited to. He liked the work. He always had. There was something honest about a building. It told you the truth about itself whether you wanted to hear it or not. You could not argue with a foundation. You could not charm a load-bearing wall into holding up something it wasn't designed to support. His mother, Irene Rees, had raised him in a small house in Antioch that she had bought with 7 years of savings and one remortgage she never fully forgave herself for. She used to stand in the kitchen after supper and look at the walls she had painted herself and say, "Calvin, a man who can fix things will never be poor, and a man who knows what's worth fixing will never be foolish." She had passed 4 years ago, a Tuesday in October, and he still heard that sentence most clearly on the mornings when he was deciding whether a thing was worth his time. He had met Vanessa at a charity auction in 2017, introduced through a mutual acquaintance who described her as driven and discerning, both of which turned out to be accurate and neither of which, it turned out, told the whole story. She was sharp and fashionable, and she asked questions quickly, as though she were running a quiet audit of whoever she was speaking to. He had found it attractive at first. There was something alive in the way she paid attention. He had thought, in those early months, that what he was watching was genuine curiosity. The audit, he had learned over 6 years, never really ended. It had simply stopped producing results she found satisfying. She had not been cruel in those first years, or perhaps the cruelty had always been there, and he had been too occupied with the work, the properties, the drawings, the early morning site visits, to notice it clearly. It was not certain it mattered now, in the way that it no longer matters whether the first crack in a foundation appeared in year 1 or year 3. Once you have established that the crack goes all the way through, he had noticed the shift, gradually. The way you noticed a structural problem, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small observations that accumulated until the picture they formed was undeniable. The way she stopped asking about his work entirely, not even the performative interest of the early years. The way she answered questions about what her husband did with a slight pause that had nothing to do with searching for the right words. The way his name had begun to disappear from conversations she recapped for him. Not excluded exactly, just absent. The way a person becomes absent from a story when they have been reclassified as background. The way she spent 3 evenings a week at dinners and functions and gallery openings that he was mentioned as unable to attend, though he had never been consulted about his availability. He had filed all of it. He had kept working. One evening, 3 weeks before the dinner at Della's, he had come home from a walkthrough of the Hermantown property to find Vanessa on the back porch, with her phone tilted inward at an angle that had become familiar. New perfume. 2. Something sharper than what she usually wore, the kind of scent that arrived in a room before the person wearing it, belonging to an occasion he hadn't been informed of. He had set down his bag and gone to the kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee the way he always had, and brought one out to her without comment. And she had set her phone face down on the arm of the chair, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that the motion had become automatic. He sat with her and drank his coffee and looked at the yard he had resodded himself the previous spring, and listened to the evening settle over the neighborhood and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the evidence had not already said more precisely. The detail he had already noticed and kept to himself was a small one, a second key on the ring she kept in her purse. He had seen it 6 weeks ago when she had asked him to get her lip balm from the bag on the kitchen counter. He had found the keys beside the lip balm and looked at them for a moment. Not his key, not the house key he recognized. A deadbolt cut, newer than the others, the kind of key that belonged to a lock he had never been invited to locate. He had set the lip balm on the counter and said nothing and handed it to her and gone back to what he was doing. He remembered it now, on the porch. He filed it where he filed everything that mattered. Not in a folder yet, not in documentation, just in the clean, organized space where he kept the things he was still watching. A man who knows what's worth fixing will never be foolish. It did not storm out of Della's. He simply stood up while Pamela was still laughing, and Vanessa was still looking at her friends with that expression of shared understanding, and he folded his napkin with the same deliberate attention he gave to every task worth completing. And he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Anhe walked to the front of the restaurant and paid the bill in full. $340 for 5 women and 1 man who had just been publicly reclassified. Anhe walked out the door into the Nashville evening without a word to anyone. His hands didn't shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He sat in the truck for a long moment without starting it. The city noise reached him through the glass, muffled and indifferent. He was not angry. He had learned to understand the precise difference between anger and clarity, the way he had learned to understand the difference between a wall that merely looked sound and a wall that had been load-tested. Anger was the response of a person who had been surprised. He had not been surprised. He had been watching for 3 years, and he had just received, at a table he had paid for, a clean and public statement of conclusions Vanessa had clearly reached long before this evening. She had said it as though it were a thing everyone already knew. Perhaps, in her circle, it was. It drove to the Craftsman in East Nashville, unlocked the front door, and walked through the unfinished front room with its bare floors and new joists and the smell of fresh lumber and honest work. Anne sat in the kitchen he had been building out by hand, and he stayed there for 2 hours in the quiet. He thought about his mother's voice, about the level on the workbench, about the 11 properties currently generating income inside a structure Vanessa had never once asked to understand. He thought about the key on her keyring that did not belong to his lock. Then he drove back to the house, their house, his name also on the deed, and he moved through it quietly in the dark, taking only what was his in a way that was clear and beyond dispute. His tools from the garage, his files from the office, his grandmother's Bible from the nightstand, his financial documents from the locked drawer in the desk that Vanessa had never asked about because the desk was not hers and therefore not interesting. He packed 2 bags and a box. He set his house key on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker he had bought. He did not leave a note because there was nothing to say that he had not already said by leaving. She had no idea, walking home to that empty kitchen, that the quiet man she had publicly called a step down had already made the call that would define the next 12 months of her life. A opened a new folder on his phone and named it Raymond. He sent one text, "Available in the morning if you are." Raymond replied in 4 minutes, 7:30. "I'll have coffee." Raymond Giles had been Calvin's attorney for 9 years, a compact, unhurried man from Memphis, who had built a small firm practice handling real estate acquisition, corporate structuring, and, increasingly, the kinds of asset protection arrangements that quiet men with complicated situations required. He was 62, wore suspenders without self-consciousness, and had a way of listening to a problem that made it feel as though he had already encountered a version of it before and was determining what, precisely, was different this time. Calvin sat across from him at 7:30 in the morning and walked him through everything in the same sequence he would have walked a project. Foundation, then framing, then the finished surface. The dinner. What was said, the 6 years before it. The key on the key ring, the new perfume, the parallel life that had been running alongside his for what his best estimate put at 14 months, possibly longer. Raymond listened without writing anything down. His coffee sat untouched and cooling in the way of a man who had forgotten it, because he was actually paying attention. When Calvin finished, Raymond looked at him steadily and said, "She's still in the house." "Yes, the house is in both names. It is." Raymond nodded slowly. "The business is clean. Rice Development Holdings is registered in Tennessee as a single-member LLC, my name only, structured into a family trust in 2019. She is not a beneficiary. She has never asked about it." Raymond allowed himself a small, considered expression that was not quite a smile. 6 years, and she never asked about the business. "She asked what I did," Calvin said. "I told her real estate development. She heard construction worker." Raymond was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a man who understood that the most important things had just been said and did not require elaboration. Then he said, "Tennessee is an equitable distribution state. But equitable does not mean equal. Assets held in a trust that predates the marriage are not part of the marital estate. She will be unhappy with what the math shows her. That is her business," Calvin said. "I want this handled cleanly and quickly." Raymond opened a legal pad, picked up a pen, and began to write. The work that followed was meticulous and took 18 days. Raymond's associate, a metodical paralegal named Gwen, who had been with the firm for 14 years, and who approached a financial records request with the same focused patience she brought to everything, built a complete inventory of Calvin's holdings. 12 properties in various stages of the portfolio, assessed at a combined $4.7 million, with a prior year net operating income of $383,000. The trust instrument was dated September 2019. The marriage had taken place in April 2021. The documents were clean, registered, and beyond dispute. The marital estate, stripped of the trust holdings, consisted primarily of the jointly titled house, $480,000 in assessed value, equity to be divided by formula, per Tennessee Code. When Raymond presented the numbers to Calvin on a Thursday afternoon, they looked at each other across the desk, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the numbers said what they said. Some things, examined closely enough, confirmed everything a careful man had already understood. Raymond also flagged something Calvin had not asked him to look for. The secondary key, the one Calvin had described from memory, matched the profile of a key type commonly used for short-term rental units in the downtown core. Gwen Cross referenced it, with a lease registered in a name Calvin did not recognize, a corporate address that dissolved to a shell entity, and a payment history linked, through two intermediary accounts, to a personal account registered to a man named Trevor Watts, who was a director of development at the financial services firm where Vanessa worked, and who had, 7 months prior, filed the change of address with the state that listed an apartment in the Gulch. Raymond presented this information to Calvin in a folder labeled simply Background. Calvin looked at it. He closed the folder. It did not need it for the legal proceedings. He already had everything the proceedings required. But it answered the question of the key, and answered it completely. And he had always preferred to understand the full architecture of a situation rather than simply the portion that was immediately useful. Real power, he had learned, operated in quiet rooms. And a man who understood the full blueprint had no reason to be startled by any of the rooms. Calvin's Aunt Dorothea lived in Madison, Tennessee, in a brick house she had occupied for 30 years with a garden that produced collard greens and sweet peppers, and an annual glut of tomatoes she distributed to neighbors without keeping score. She had worked in family court administration for 21 years and had seen the full range of what people did to each other when the contract of a marriage was unwinding. Calvin drove out on a Thursday evening and sat at her kitchen table while she made tea, and he told her what had happened. She listened. She poured the tea. She sat down across from him. You built everything that woman walked past every day without looking at, she said. And she couldn't find the floor she was standing on. She looked at him with the steady warmth of a woman who had loved him since he was 8 years old and had no reason to soften what she saw. Your mother would have told you to walk away clean and let God handle the rest. I am going to tell you the same thing, except Raymond Giles handles it first, and God can have whatever's left over. Calvin almost smiled. Almost. 12 properties, she said quietly, as though turning the number over. 12. She shook her head, not in disbelief, but in the specific way of someone confirming what they had long suspected. Steady, Calvin. She said it not as an insult, but as a precise description of the most dangerous kind of man. Go on, then. Let Raymond do the work. Ed drove back to East Nashville and finished the kitchen in the Craftsman that weekend. Tile he had selected himself, counters measured to within an eighth of an inch. Cabinet hardware it had researched for 2 months before ordering. He moved into the finished house on a Saturday and stood at the kitchen counter at 7 in the morning, with the first cup of coffee he had made there, looking at what his hands had built from something that had been ready to be torn down. The thought he had, standing there, was not about Vanessa. It was about his mother's kitchen in Antioch, about the way the light had come through that window on winter mornings when she was alive, about the way a room held the memory of the person who had made it what it was. The thing he built does the talking. Vanessa called 3 times that weekend. He set the phone face down on the counter and let it go to voicemail each time. It had nothing left to say that was not already in Raymond's documents, organized by date, ready to be delivered. The petition was filed on a Wednesday. Raymond served it through a process server at 9 in the morning while Vanessa was at the house. His house technically, her residence temporarily. The situation shortly to be clarified by the state of Tennessee. She called Calvin at 9:14. He was at a property walkthrough in Germantown. He declined the call. She called 11 more times before noon. Hay declined every one. Hay understood that there was a version of this, perhaps the version she had been operating on, in which Calvin Reese, steady Calvin, the man she had married down to accommodate, would hear the panic in the repeated calls and come back, would want to explain himself, would need her to understand that he had not left casually, that she should take him seriously, that he deserved a response. It did not need any of those things. What he needed was finished. It was in Raymond's folder, and it had been filed with the court, and it would proceed at the pace the law set for it, which was the only pace that mattered. Raymond's office sent a formal letter that afternoon. It detailed the scope of Calvin's holdings. It named Reese Development Holdings and the trust. It listed the 12 properties by address and assessed value. It noted, with the measured neutrality of legal language, that the marital estate consisted primarily of the jointly titled residence, and that the division thereof would proceed according to Tennessee's equitable distribution standards. Vanessa's attorney, a woman she had apparently retained within 48 hours of receiving the petition, which told you something about how much preparation had already been in motion on her side, sent a response that questioned the timing and scope of the trust documentation. Raymond's office replied with the trust instrument, dated 2019, notarized and registered predating the marriage by 2 years. There was nothing to contest. The document said what it said. A foundation either held or it didn't. 6 months after Calvin had walked out of Della's restaurant, Vanessa called his number 47 times in the span of a single day. It had Raymond's office. Log it as a record. Because Calvin Reese was the kind of man who kept the records that proved what had been built was sound. He did not answer once. She had no idea, even then, that the man she had publicly called a step down had already broken ground on his 13th property. The paperwork was finalized on a Tuesday in March, 7 months after the dinner at Della's, in a mediator's office, in a building downtown that Calvin had driven past 100 times without occasion to enter. Vanessa sat across the table from him for the first time since he had left, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent the intervening months revising a story and had not yet settled on a version that fully made sense. He looked at her with no particular expression at all. Raymond walked through the settlement. The house would be listed and the equity split per the formula. Calvin's business holdings were not at issue. There was no contestable ground remaining. The mediator, a patient woman named Claire who had seen this particular shape of situation before, asked if both parties were prepared to sign. Vanessa looked at Calvin once more. It was the look of someone with a question they had waited too long to ask. "I didn't know," she said finally, quietly, not as an apology exactly, more as the statement of a person who had only recently understood the dimensions of what they had walked past without looking. He considered this for a moment. "I know," he said. He signed the documents. He thanked Claire and Raymond. He left the building and stood briefly in the morning light on the sidewalk, listening to the city doing what a city did on a Tuesday. And then he walked to his truck and drove back to East Nashville and the work that was waiting for him. Real power had never needed an audience. 9 months had passed like water when Calvin stood on the front porch of the Craftsman in East Nashville on a warm September morning and looked out at the street he had moved onto without fanfare. Anne had slowly come to understand as home. The Japanese maple he had planted in the front yard the previous spring had put out a flush of new growth. The porch he had rebuilt from scratch was leveled to within a quarter-inch across its full width. He had checked. Reese Development Holdings had closed on properties 13 and 14 in August. The combined acquisition cost was $890 million, and the projected 5-year return on the portfolio was a number he had shared only with Raymond and with his financial advisor, a meticulous woman named Evelyn, who had managed Calvin's account since before the marriage, and who had once told him, with the affectionate bluntness of a person who has earned the right to speak plainly, "You are quietly one of the most solvent men I have ever worked with, and you dress like someone who parks cars." He had laughed. Actually laughed. There was a woman named Josephine now, Jo to the people she let call her that, who was an architect with a firm that specialized in adaptive reuse projects, turning old things into new ones, without erasing what they had been. She had opinions about window-to-wall ratios and historic preservation codes, and she asked about his work with the specific interest of someone who understood what the work actually was. They had met at a property review 8 months ago. She had pointed out a load path issue in his renovation drawings that he had overlooked. He had corrected it. They had gotten coffee afterward, and she had said without any particular ceremony that she thought he was probably very good at what he did, and he had told her he thought the same of her. And that had been enough of a foundation to build on. What had become of Vanessa he knew through channels he had not sought out. Her sister had mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance who had told Raymond, who had told Calvin in a single sentence, because Calvin had never asked for more than that. She had left the house after the sale. She was in an apartment now, smaller than what she was accustomed to, in a part of the city she had once described as somewhere she would never live. The position at her firm had changed. A restructuring, a title that carried less weight than the one before it. Pamela had stopped returning her calls. The circle of women at the long table had grown quieter around her, the way circles do when the story one person has been telling turns out to be the one they invented. No, one had called her on it. They hadn't needed to. The truth had simply taken up the space the story used to occupy. Calvin drank his coffee. The maple held its color in the morning light. Josephine's car was in the driveway. He had built everything worth keeping. The rest had always been hers to carry. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.